Thank you for listening to this Forum podcast. Please check out our website for a rich archive of podcasts and writing from contemporary philosophers and other researchers on a wide variety of topics. The Forum is an educational charity dedicated to bringing academic philosophy to a broader audience. Please consider donating to us via our Just Giving page, which you can find on our website. Happy listening.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Danielle Sands. I'm a fellow at the Forum and I'm going to be chairing this evening. And we're going to be thinking about invasive species. So let me introduce our speakers, Fred Pearce, Emma Townshend and Chris Thomas. The format for the event is that our speakers will be discussing the issues and you'll have plenty of time to jump in with your questions during the conversation. So perhaps we could start with you, Chris. Tell us a little bit about invasive species. What are they? Is it a useful name? How do they differ from what we call native species?
Well, it's great being here, and so there's a number of words in use. So one is invasive species, and that's usually defined as being something that's harmful to us or to other forms of wildlife. And that's great as in principle, but the difficulty is that not all humans are in agreement as to what we think is harmful. So one person might like a species that is a particular pretty flower, and somebody else might think it's a horrible thing. Then there's non-native, which generally means that it arrives sometime sort of fairly recently, and then native species is those good old, in this context here, those good old British species which have been with us for a long time. The problem is all of these definitions are totally and utterly arbitrary, and people are getting very uptight and try to exterminate invasive species and to some extent non-native species. And a quick thought experiment really allows you to sort of see the problem. So 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, we were in an ice age, and virtually none of the species that you will see around here now today, be that in and around London, or if you go onto Hampstead Heath or wherever, virtually none of those species lived in the British Isles at all. What in a geological time is a moment ago. And then peoples, of course, were going back and forth to Europe, and sometimes we brought accidentally or deliberately, we brought species with us. And this was happening from very early times when people were using certain plants for medicinal reasons and so on. So the Romans are often blamed for bringing a lot of things here, but actually it's a more continuous flow back and forth from the continent. So if something like, for example, the brown hare, the European brown hare, that arrived about the time of the Romans or soon afterwards. That's not a native species by definition, even though it's on our protected list of species now. So by and large, if something arrived, the Romans brought them in, then we think, okay, that's fine. That's long enough ago. But the Normans, soon after, the Normans are probably responsible for the rabbit, although the Romans did have some in captivity. So is a rabbit native? Is 1,000 years enough? So when we get to about 500 years ago, things like the sycamore tree, not so sure about that, I'm a bit uncomfortable about that. And then almost everything, be it rhododendrons or Himalayan balsam or anything else that came in the last few hundred years, then that gets the official disapproval. But time is a continuous thing, and all of these are basically recent. Similarly, from how far, an equally arbitrary question is not just how long has something got to be in a particular place before we consider it native, but how far away does it come before we treat it as a foreigner. If something just pops over the channel from France, it seems that we're more prepared to accept it than if it comes from much more distant locations. So my argument, as others have said in the past, would be that we should really think about how we interact with species based on the consequences for us and our perception of how we would like the environment to be, rather than some notion of nativeness and duration and how foreign they are.
And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the relationship between diversity and non-native species. I mean, I think we tend to think that when non-native species are introduced, then diversity diminishes. Is this the case, or?
Well, it can be. And so this is one of these difficult things in public and policy forums, because it is undoubtedly true that invasive species, things like rats arriving, and humans for that matter, arriving on Pacific islands, have driven a number of flightless birds extinct. That's quite clear. But almost all countries in the world, it may well be all, but I'm saying almost because I'm not sure it is every single one of them, that the transport of species, that mainly under us doing it, has resulted in an increase in the number of species that live in each country. So if we take Britain, there are close to 2,000 officially non-native animal and plant species, about 3/4 of those are plants, living in the British Isles. So then the question is, so the number of species in Britain is, with all these introductions, including the ones I've mentioned like brown hare and rabbit, about a couple of thousand extra species in the country now. So the question is, how many native species have become extinct from the entire country, not just a local area or even quite a substantial area of the country? How many native species have become extinct from the whole of Great Britain as a result of these 2,000 additions? Answers on a postcard? Any answers? Anyone want to chance their arm? 5. Any advance on 5?
Nobody knows because there's no baseline from which to do the research.
The answer is 0. There is no known. There are species that have died out during these few thousand years, but as far as we know, it's not a direct consequence of the new species arriving. Now, there are species that declined a great deal because of the new arrivals, like red squirrel, for example, particularly with the pathogens that are the diseases that the grey squirrel is more resistant to. But as far as we know, and so the net result has been extra species in the country, and this goes for most parts of the world. And in addition to that, a fairly small number, but there are actually new species that have come into existence. So very recently, in the last year or two, yet another species of monkey flower has been discovered, where one parent was imported as a plant, as a horticultural plant, a species of mimulus, the monkey flowers, those nice yellow things that grow on damp ground. One species came from South America, one came from North America, and they were both brought to Britain. They made friends, they produced nice seeds, and their offspring was sterile, but they could grow clonally as many plants could, so they didn't die out. And then, by a sort of genetic accident, in a couple of places, they doubled the number of chromosomes in each cell, and occasionally these genetic accidents happen. Normally genetic accidents result in the offspring being dead because it doesn't work, but in a couple of occasions it's worked. And as it has now doubled its chromosomes, this new plant can now reproduce sexually, so it's effectively like any other species, but because it's doubled its number of chromosomes, it no longer reproduces with the parental plant. So effectively, it's that we've got new species in Britain. In fact, we've got about half a dozen of them. In fact, Primula Quinces there's a species that's entirely restricted to horticulture and started off with a hybridization event in Kew Gardens. So we've got, let's say, half a dozen new species. And interestingly, that's more than the total number of species extinctions that are known of plants in Europe in the last few hundred years, at least as listed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I suspect that there are some that aren't listed and that the list is incomplete. But it's not obvious in Europe, because of all of these introductions and hybridization, it's not obvious that the number of plant species in Europe is going down. The world total, the contribution of Britain in the last 3 centuries to world diversity has been, surprisingly, to increase the number of species on the planet.
Wow. You've won me over. But given that what you're saying is that the introduction of non-native species has overall increased diversity, except with some very specific examples.
Yeah.
Why do we think it's decreased diversity? Is there something about non-native species that speaks to our misconceptions about nature?
I think there's two things. One is that there has been an inappropriate transfer of effectively blame from one kind of situation where invasive species are problematic. So a lot of these animals and plants that have evolved in isolation on Pacific and other oceanic islands have lived in places, for example, where there are no ground-living mammals which act as predators. And when we and rats and pigs and dogs and so on arrived, they, A, weren't afraid, B, couldn't escape fast enough, and by having several different mammals, the rats, for example, could polish off ground-living chicks. We could polish off the adults, and they're quite slow-growing animals, some of these things, and we were just killing them. All these mammals that arrived were killing them faster than they could reproduce. But it's extreme, and you get extinctions as well in isolated lakes when you get a completely different kind of fish, let's say, that is released into these isolated environments, and something completely different arrives. That's when it tends to cause a problem. But in virtually all continental areas, as far as we know, the complete extermination of any species by an invasive is incredibly rare. It's an unusual thing. But because they are problematic in some situations, I think they've transferred that to situations where actually the issue is a different one.
Right, so we tend to think of isolated environments as the model for thinking about...
I think that's... So in the scientific literature and the environmental conservation literature, invasive species are clearly a major, have been at least in the last few thousand years, have been a major cause of extinction. Therefore, invasive species everywhere are a major problem.
Right.
So that's, I think, is part of the story. And the other is that somehow or other we've ended up with this view, a human view of the way that biology works, that sort of there's a way that nature should be. But if you look at the British Isles and indeed increasing fractions of the entire planet, there is no way that nature's meant to be. We've messed the whole thing up already. And so at the moment, there's nothing correct about the current state of nature. And so, but what a lot of people seem to be doing mentally is when something else arrives, and clearly if you get some new plants arrive, let's say, even if they're not going to exterminate any of the ones that were there before, if all these extra plants, these 2,000 extra plants, are using up 5%, 10% of the land surface, evidently there's going to be somewhat less space occupied by some of the plants that were there before. And so we often see this as a departure from how we think the state of the world somehow should be, and therefore these additions of new species are somehow seen as almost equivalent to an additional loss rather than a gain of species. But it's a bit bizarre that more species, and on average each of them being slightly rarer, that somehow as the world is, at least in Britain, is changing to be a little bit more like this potentially, that we're seeing this as a bad thing. But if we go to Amazonia, it's absolutely full of species, huge number, and large numbers of them are extremely rare. And we think of this as the heights of diversity. So we're having kind of, when things change, not necessarily in an objectively negative way. Well, we only have a human perspective of what is negative and positive, of course. But it's a real challenge. I think that we are very slippery in our thinking, and that as I say, we're transferring blame from one location to other locations where it doesn't apply in anything like the same way. And when we get changes that somehow make us feel that the world is less how it used to be, then we tend to have a negative response to it. But nature does change. Every biological process, be it ecology and evolution, is about dynamic change. And whatever we might like, as environmentalists as anyone, whatever we might like, we're not going to stop the world changing with or without us. And given how many of us there are on the planet and how much we're consuming and how much the land we need for farming and so on, it is inevitable that it's going to carry on changing. So rather than just grizzle about change the whole time, we should perhaps think about how we manage and modify that changes in ways that we find acceptable to us as citizens of the planet, rather than try and keep things as they are, or for that matter revert to some sort of rose-tinted vision of the past.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll take a couple of questions for you before we move on. Anyone's got a question at this stage? Yeah?
Thanks. I was just wondering
Can you just wait for the microphone to come? Thanks.
Thanks. I was just wondering if there are possibly like different ways to measure diversity. So if diversity as like number of species is like is one way of doing it, and then you can say like diversity hasn't gone down with invasive species, but it might be also sort of like relative proportions of different species. So it could be, say, and I really don't know the details, so I'm asking, say like the grey squirrel has led to a massive reduction in the red squirrel, and there's a very dominant new species that might lead to a decrease on another measure of diversity.
Don't ask a biologist how to measure diversity, and I will be very kindly, won't bore you with endless details, but you're completely right that you can measure these things in different ways. In the context of the red and the grey squirrel, we used to have what we refer to and smile native species, and now we have one dominant foreign species. But now in large parts of the country, what was just one species of squirrel is now still just one species of squirrel, but it is a different species of squirrel. It turns out the grey squirrel is better adapted to broad-leaved woodland, deciduous woodland that drops its leaves in the winter, than the red squirrel is. And there's little chance that a whole European scale, the grey squirrel would be able to exterminate the entire red. It's possible, but very unlikely. So yes, changes in abundance happen. So this was a sort of question actually that biologists had put to me and others, and so I decided to have a look at the data a bit. Because they say, you know, that these non-native species are becoming rampant and they're sort of exterminating lots of stuff. And what we actually, so we looked at, there's a program called the Countryside Survey Squares, where every so often a whole bunch of botanists and other people go out and they look at areas of the countryside and they look and see what species are there and how abundant some of them are. And so what we did was to compare the abundance changes of so-called native species, and that is to say arrived in the last 15,000 years, versus non-native species, that is to say arrived in the last 2,000 years. And what we found was that the species that had changed their abundances the most, surprisingly, were native species, including increases. So things like stinging nettles were doing well, brambles are doing well, and so on. So that the species that had become of plant that had changed and become more common through time were predominantly actually native species. And although some of the non-native species had increased, some of the non-native species had decreased. So there wasn't a kind of obvious big distinction there. And the real message there is that the environment is indeed changing, the abundances of species are changing, but that the real drivers are other things going on in the countryside, and both the native species and the non-native species are responding to these and changing their abundances as a consequence.
Can I add something about the numbers and counting up biodiversity? Because as I understand it, quite often ecologists don't count the alien species that come in. They simply refuse to believe that they should be there or that they exist. So they only count what they regard as the native species.
So if you
discount all the other ones. So
totally.
That way, you know, our biodiversity can only, the number of species can only go down.
So very often
they don't count the other stuff, even though everything else is moving around. I find that, you know, I mean, as an outsider, I find that really weird.
And they're left out of checklists and floras quite often as well, like the big stace that you would use for wildflower recognition in the UK. I think he did include some, but you know, you might not even be able to identify them because you wouldn't, they wouldn't even be in the flora.
Yeah.
Just pretend they're not there.
Yeah, and so when you see news reports of what's happening to biodiversity indicators, for example, normally they do not have, it is just the status of what happens to the abundances of the previously native species. And if you think about it, this is actually destined for decline because it's almost bound to be, because if you start with the state of the world in a particular place and start monitoring it, and everything is dynamic, you're going to move away from that baseline through time. So you have to be very careful that you don't construct these things in a way where it is an absolute certainty that that movement away from the baseline is going to result in the apparent appearance of decline.
There's another weird thing that happens is that species can be both endangered and invasive.
Yeah.
Because they're endangered in their sort of natural habitat. I mean, there's the cocky frog in Puerto Rico is one that comes to mind, which is endangered in its natural habitat because most of the forests were destroyed. But it is regarded as an invasive species in the Hawaiian Islands, where it's running riot, and everybody's really cross. So quite a lot of species are both endangered and invasive. I mean, you know.
Fred,
I don't think that's functioning ecology. I mean, I think this is a problem not for nature. This is a problem for ecologists.
Right, for how we think about these things.
Yeah, we're just getting it wrong.
But
it's a bit unfair to all
as
ecologists.
as a card-carrying ecologist, I would say I would I would simply spread the blame to a much wider proportion of society
Probably
in the
journalists
environment.
like me, I would guess.
They're always getting it.
Fred, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about this demonisation of non-native and or invasive species and what you think the causes of that are.
Well, I mean, Chris has touched on it, but I mean, I think there are two things. Well, I mean, there's the personal thing and there's the sort of academic environment. Which, a lot of us, we recoil a bit at the unfamiliar, that if some change happens, some species or plant shows up, or some people that show up sometimes, and we sort of recoil a bit. Do we want them? So there's a sort of natural, I suppose, conservatism. Well, the same word as conservation. You see a lot of conservationists are really very conservative people. Except there are exceptions. There are some of the alien species that we make honorary natives, just because we like them, really. So rabbits are, I guess, a reasonable example of that, though they've been around 1,000 years. But the edible dormouse, which is called edible because the Romans ate them. And I think I'm right, it's only been around in the UK about 100 years, and it's been made a protected species already. It's kind of, it's got a pass for some reason. And the only reason,
why is that, do you think? What distinction? Because it's cute?
People like them.
Okay.
I don't think there's any scientific rationale for it.
People who live in the Chilterns don't like it because it goes it roosts in their roofs and so on.
In which case, I'm surprised that the people of the Chiltern haven't got it taken off the list. Yeah. Anyway, but it is protected.
Isn't it the case that the edible dormice were introduced to this country by the Romans? So there are bones found in our archaeological.
And then they went away again. Yeah.
And then they were reintroduced.
That's right. No, but they were reintroduced. You're quite right. You are correct. Yeah. I think the other thing is, it's the way that. Again, I'm going to criticise ecologists here, and my apologies, but the way that a lot of ecological thinking has gone. We have these ideas about sort of climax ecosystems, a sort of sense that a really good ecosystem, a rainforest or whatever it was somehow perfected. I mean, Darwin never thought of evolution as producing perfection, though Lamarck did. But this idea, and ecologists took this idea very strongly, especially during a lot of the 20th century, this idea that somehow ecosystems were perfect and couldn't be improved, and everything had co-evolved to work within this system. And if you have that idea about, if you like, how nature works, then anything that comes in from outside can't really have a role. It can't find a role. It's disruptive. It's just causing damage. So if you take that view, and a lot of, well, some ecologists, an awful lot of conservationists and environmentalists, I think, just instinctively take that view, that we need to preserve these perfect systems and prevent them from being damaged by invader species or whatever else it is. But there's, to caricature slightly, there's a completely different view of ecology, which sees most ecosystems being very temporary, very kind of transient, species coming in and out. And, I mean, not because of human activity, but just normally. So if you take that view, then there's nothing intrinsically bad about an alien species coming in, a foreign species coming in. It may do something which you regard as harm, or it may not. But there's nothing intrinsically bad about it. So I think if you put these two, the sort of personal side and the sort of the academic traditions of kind of conservation thinking, put them together, it's quite a powerful kind of argument. I mean, I think that's wrong. I mean, I think we shouldn't be trying. I mean, there's a case for preserving endangered species because they could be part of the mix for future evolution. But I think we probably should also be thinking about conserving the dynamism of nature. I mean, that's the essence of nature, is that it's got by through all sorts of crises over, hundreds of millions of years. And it does it because it can evolve and develop, and this is something which Chris writes about in his book a lot. And it's the dynamism that we want to keep. So my view about alien species is that often they're part of the solution and not part of the problem, because they're often the most dynamic species, a species that can move in and sort of grow fast and develop. We begin to think of it as a problem, but you can look at it the other way around. You can see it as kind of sort of nature's go-getters, nature's colonists, nature's troublemakers, maybe. But those are probably the species that we need if we want to revive ecosystems in the 21st century. I mean, I really think we need to, we really need to revive nature. It had a huge amount of damage done it to in the 20th century. So I think I'm with sort of mainstream ecologists saying we need to revive nature, rewilding or whatever you want to call it, in the 21st century. Just that I rather think that invasive species are part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Thanks. I mean, it's one of the issues here that we find it hard to distinguish what's good for us economically from what's good for nature more broadly.
Yeah, I think we get those two confused. And, we can, if we've got a species that's coming in that's really messing up our gardens or is bringing, it's a disease that's knocking out our trees, of course we want to do something about it. And that's reasonable, and especially, if we're in the Anthropocene now, I mean, that's we've got really no choice but to manage those kind of things. But I think we should be careful about pretending that when we're doing that, we're helping nature anyway, because we may be damaging nature's ability to adapt and evolve and move on and colonize areas that we've messed up. So I think we should be a bit careful. As I say, I'm not saying that we shouldn't want to intervene at various times of various species, but we should remember that we're doing it for us and not for nature.
Right, so we should be careful about being disingenuous about our motivation.
I think we're quite slippery. We can do that quite a lot.
But it's not just about being disingenuous, is it? It's also like the surprise effect, where you get rid of an invasive species and then you get a surprise.
But surprises do happen from time to time. Nobody would have guessed that the Japanese knotweed or something like that would take off.
But you might, or another one might, something else comes to fill the gap. It's not, you don't restore.
Yeah, time doesn't really have a reverse gear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You might just make something else the invasive species in that gap.
Right.
That's true. I mean, you're quite right. And when we're managing any kind of environment, stuff can happen that is a bit disruptive. Well, I think we kind of have to embrace that a bit now. I mean, I don't think we're in a world where... Well, I don't think we were ever in a world where things were kind of stable and not changing, and therefore if you left things alone, nothing much would happen. So I think we've got to get a bit more real about how nature works, and sometimes, it's disruptive.
So Fred, you're saying intervention is fine sometimes.
Yeah.
When? Can you give us some guidelines about when and how to intervene?
Well, I mean, I think if you've got something like Japanese knotweed and a number of these foreign species that have done quite a lot of damage in people's gardens, and if you read some versions, they're sort of destroying houses, foundations, and all that kind of thing. I mean, we want to do something.
I don't think Chris is having any.
No. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they can be really inconvenient. But it's actually a pretty rare plant at a national.
Well, Chris, you were saying
level.
earlier that you had some.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's right. Was attacking your foundations.
Yeah, that's right.
I wasn't quite clear whether you were cheering it on or whether you were.
Yeah, no.
No, I mean,
but I agree with you.
We do. But think about something like Japanese knotweed. A lot of people will tend to say it's a scourge in the environment and it's damaging biodiversity in Britain. Well, it's not at all. It is a problem in gardens. It's a problem on disturbed land, roadside verges, along canals, cemeteries, that kind of thing. But out in the countryside, it's very rare.
But 3/4 of the reason, in my mind, that it is in some occasions a problem. But
it's a problem for us, not for the wider nature.
Yeah, but part of it is a problem we've made for ourselves because we have legislated about its extermination, and that then gets in the way of our building projects, etc., as much as the issue of that the plant is going to cause direct
you
harm.
can't sell your house because everybody's scared because it's Japanese.
That's right.
Well, in fact, I know someone whose mortgage lender wouldn't lend on the basis that there was knotweed.
So when you read sometimes, as I do, really scary numbers for how many millions or billions of pounds of damage is being done to Britain by alien species, you suddenly discover that it's not actually sort of physical damage done. It's damage to people's property prices, which have to do with the way that we react.
And also, they can count rabbits. They can count, and one of these figures, a ginormous, hundreds of billions figure for the US, counts flu.
Oh yeah, there's.
And days lost to work.
But even when
very large figures you see about the cost of invasive.
But even when
every mouse in the US has got a value of about $20 on it, as the damage it does. God knows where that number came from.
But even when it's a sort of. It's not one of those things like flu or a lot of those costs are voluntary costs because we have decided that we would like to exterminate or reduce the abundance or something. So for something like rhododendron, for example, I believe we spend more money on trying to exterminate that, even though species of rhododendron used to live in the British Isles in a previous warm period of few 100,000 years ago. So it's, if you like, it's a return of the nearly native. But we are spending more money on trying to exterminate that than any other plant. And that is an expression of human desire as to how we would like the landscape and nature to be, rather than a direct cost that the plant is inevitably doing to us.
So I mean, most of the numbers that you'll ever see reported are complete and absolute nonsense. They really are, because as Chris says, they're not based on real damage. They're based on sort of weird.
But we're still spending it.
You still haven't given me an answer. You said we were allowed to intervene in certain cases, and then the knotweed came up and.
You are allowed to get rid of knotweed.
Okay.
Definitely.
We've just got to get real about it. I mean, the thing about knotweed
it's hard.
is...
It's really hard.
The panel will vote yes, you can sometimes get rid of knotweed.
The other thing I was going to say about knotweed is, yes, it's a problem in gardens, and we might want to do something about that without creating real scare problems with house prices, which is largely unnecessary. But it's not actually a problem in the countryside. I mean, the hot spot for Japanese knotweed in the UK is Swansea, which I think is the only city it's the only town in the world with a Japanese knotweed officer in the local council. Wow. He's quite a busy chap, because I mean, there is. If I was giving you my PowerPoint presentation, I'd show you some scary pictures of Japanese knotweed in Swansea. Right over the border right next door to Swansea is the Gower Peninsula, which is a highly, regarded natural or relatively natural area. Everybody loves the Gower Peninsula. There are no Japanese knotweed in the Gower Peninsula because it doesn't jump into nature. In fact, yesterday I was in Germany having a debate with somebody about this same issue, with somebody complaining about Japanese knotweed in Germany. in the Black Forest area. And she said the same thing. Said, yeah, we have real problems with Japanese knotweed in the gardens, but there's no Japanese knotweed in the Black Forest. It doesn't go there. So again, you know, we can get...
Well, you know, there's only one, I can't remember which one it is, but there's only one gender of the plant got introduced to Europe, so it only reproduces by fragments. It doesn't sexually reproduce and set seed. Now, if we wanted to have a great fun in Europe, we'd add the other gender and then really see what happens.
Yes.
Slightly horrific idea.
The Japanese have probably thought of it.
Okay, should we take a couple of questions for Fred at this stage? Yeah, lady in the front.
They seem to switch a bit indiscriminately between non-native and invasive. But I come from Australia, where white folk came in and they've made more mammals extinct than actually exist in the whole UK biota, so-called native biota. But is it not the case
Not
that
now
our
we've introduced so many to
There are
Britain.
actually more mammals
foxes
in
and
Australia than there were
cats did a
before.
lot of the work for us, yeah. But is it not the case, and particularly again in Australia, that agriculture has actually arguably been the biggest invasive change? Sheep and goats made the Sahara and the Mesopotamian desert and the Australian deserts. So it's and almost all of our garden plants are non-native, although very few have actually turned invasive. But effectively, what we do by way of gardening and farming is almost entirely non-native species, many of which are really, we manage them in totally invasive numbers.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Exactly what you say, I think is right. That everybody blamed rabbits in Australia. You know, rabbits had run riot, and they were knocking down the fences, and there were millions of them, and they were destroying the landscape. In fact, most of the original landscape had been really messed up by sheep. But the sheep farmers wanted to blame the rabbits, so I think that's kind of how that happened. I mean, you can't say anything other than the Australian landscape and its range of species has been fantastically and hugely transformed by the arrival of Europeans. There's no doubt about that at all. But they've actually got more biodiversity than they had before. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's worth weighing in the balance.
No, they've lost 50 mammals. 54?
A lot of those mammals were lost 55,000 years ago when the first Aboriginal population...
This is since white folk arrived.
Name them.
Name them, yeah. I would need to check. So virtually all, with the exception of a couple of kangaroos, virtually all of the mammals that were native, land mammals, and some of the large lizards that were native to Australia were exterminated following the arrival of the Aboriginal population. Originally, these can be timed quite clearly to about 55,000 years ago. Then there was another additional slight phase that arrived, I think it's about 10,000 years ago when the dingoes arrived. The dingoes are relatively much more recent arrival. And yes, there has been a big spate of further extinctions, but quite a lot of them still survive on offshore islands or in Tasmania, for example. So I'd be quite surprised if it was that number that you say, but I'm always happy to be wrong. It means I've learned something.
I mean, there's still an argument going on in Australia, as I'm sure you know, about whether the dingo should be regarded as native after 5,000 years or whatever it is.
Yeah, but it's now an interesting challenge in Australia, because now they've got, the debate is over things like camels, for example, because given that the very large, for example, there used to be a wombat that was close to rhinoceros size, and that's extinct. So should we now regard the feral buffalo that have come from southern Asia and the camels that have come in, should we? So there's a real debate amongst Australian ecologists as to whether the vegetation in the long run in Australia would be better off by having effectively these replacement herbivores going around browsing and grazing the vegetation, or whether you should just exterminate everything that doesn't come from Australia, and there is no consensus at the moment.
Thanks. It's actually almost a little bit of a follow-on from that, but I've sort of been thinking about this sort of slightly convoluted theory, but taking those examples of oceanic or sort of island extinctions in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, places like that, it seems fairly, and things like the dodo and so on, it seems fairly clear to me that there's been a reduction in global biodiversity thanks to species invasions. Is that right? The
number of species. So if you take all of the species on the planet and you mix them all up, some species are not compatible with others and die out. And the total number of species on the planet is now smaller than it used to be as a consequence of biological invasions, particularly if you can include humans as an invasive species. But the number of species per country, paradoxically, has increased. And as I said, the number of species of plant in the last few hundred years, as far as we know, the total number of plant species in North America as well as in Europe seems to be that more species have come into existence than died out in that period. And so I have argued in my book, Inheritors of the Earth, that in the very long run, all of these species that we have moved around the world will start to diverge in their new homes, and we may indeed effectively generate a long-term mass diversification.
It seems to me that there's a kind of, I'm sure you addressed this in your book, and I'm sorry I haven't read it, but it feels like there's a sort of disconnect in terms of the timescales where this mass exchange of animal populations and plants between continents has been happening on a serious scale for 50 years, really, with sort of...
No, it's been much longer.
But in terms of, I think it's accelerating. Obviously, it's been happening, but in terms of, things like the creation of the Panama Canal...
For mammals and birds, a ballpark estimate, nobody's got a good estimate of this, it doesn't exist, but a ballpark estimate that about 2/3 of the species of mammals and birds which have been exterminated by humans and the invasive species that we have moved died out before 500 years ago, earlier than that.
So even if it's 500 years compared to evolutionary timescales, especially if you're thinking of mammals and birds, that's a kind of happening over millennia, if not millions of years. And so what I was thinking is, we've seen this process happen very quickly on islands, in isolated populations, and not just literal islands, but also ecosystems that function as islands. It's happened very quickly. It's kind of been accelerated because those species are more adapted to living in those environments. Is there perhaps, are we just not seeing those species exterminated yet all around the world because it's happening more slowly? So are we just seeing this kind of globalization of nature where, New Zealand and Britain, they're essentially now converging towards having the same fauna, yes, more in each country, but overall a smaller number?
Well, is that like the McDonaldization of world biodiversity? Yeah,
so we have a smaller, we have a globalization of culture, we have less different things overall.
But the thing is, I think that one of the issues that perhaps that isn't explicit is that the species on islands often represent, they can be tiny little populations. Like, for example, if you look at Madagascar, it's a huge percentage of the species are endemic. And so the way that extinction happens in those places, it is kind of a separate category.
It very much is, and it turns out that most of the extinctions that have been caused by invasive species and the ongoing ones are being caused by about 10 non-native species at the moment. So on those oceanic islands, there were no there was occasionally bird malaria, but there weren't any mosquitoes that could transmit it. So a lot of the Hawaiian birds have died out because continental diseases arrived and the native birds were not resistant to them. And admittedly, the non-native birds could help the disease going, but they were more or less resistant to it. And so you've got a situation there where essentially all continental birds have some resistance to this kind of disease, so they're not about to die out from the same reason. There was a subset of birds that were susceptible to it. Similarly, there's a subset of birds on these oceanic islands that can't deal with land-living mammals. But if you go to so these flightless, disproportionately flightless birds and large, heavy-bodied birds died out from these oceanic islands when invasive predators arrived. If you look at similar kinds of birds, even in Australia where they survive pretty well, and right through the main continents. So we've got pheasants, for example. They're a walking bird. They're quite fat, but they can still fly if they're attacked by a terrestrial mammal, so they've got an escape mechanism. It's the same with the mallee fowl in Australia, and then the flightless birds that we've got on the bigger continents pack a big kick, and actually they can run fast, so they can escape from predators. So it was a category of type of bird that just couldn't cope with what came from the continents. These islands were missing effectively a functional group of animals, ground-living mammals, and types of disease and their vector that are on the continent. And there are some things happening on the continent. Diseases of amphibians, for example, is particularly the biggest example. But there's no particular reason that the sorts of things we seen on those islands is going to then happen over longer timescales on the continents. We've looked as far as we can on timescales of centuries, and in most cases problems don't seem to get worse.
And it also highlights that really important question, which is, how do you value a species which maybe only has, that we may only know 100 individuals? Is that incredible because it's so unique, or is it to be valued slightly less because it's, because it's a very small population? That is a philosophical question in the end. That is not.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah. And there's no easy answer for people who try to measure biodiversity about what priorities should be.
Well, let me say, I think there's a really interesting question that you raised here. I mean, is there a balance between global biodiversity and local biodiversity? Is it a good thing or a bad thing if there's more local biodiversity but less global biodiversity? I don't think we know the answer to that, really, but you could make the case that local biodiversity matters more, because a lot of ecology shows, convincingly to me at any rate, that biodiversity is really just the number of species around is really valuable for making an ecosystem more kind of resilient in the face of climate change or whatever comes along. So local biodiversity is really, really important in just helping some system it'll probably evolve and change, but keeping a forest and just letting it adapt to whatever shows up. I'm not sure that there is any particular evidence, tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure there's any particular evidence that global biodiversity actually matters that much. Maybe it'll matter more when there are more species moving around, and maybe maybe there's a kind of...
The only thing one could add to that is that global diversity might be a bit of an insurance policy for us in the context that we have no idea what humans are going to do to the planet over the next 1,000 years, and the more different types of things are in existence somewhere, the more are going to be available to make those future ecosystems that we currently can't imagine.
I think fair. I wouldn't want to exterminate global diversity on the altar of...
But ultimately, this is a human decision.
It's a really interesting question.
Emma, perhaps we can think about this historically a bit more, and particularly in the way that kind of colonialist, imperialist histories have played out in relation to introduction of non-native species.
Well, I am quite interested in looking at it, in looking at the whole idea of being invasive historically.
Yeah.
Because when you think back to the 17th century. You know, when you think about us, I say us, the English people, you know, planting colonies. It's called planting. You plant America, you make a plantation there. We are travelling with our crops and our livestock. At that point, the idea of an invasive species doesn't exist at all. It's actually a very positive thing. You get somebody like Linnaeus in the 18th century. In the 18th century, you have the idea of improvement. You will set off to improve. There's this idea that, as you were saying, is sort of like the idea of the perfected rainforest. What happens in the 17th and 18th century is people believing that that the world is improvable. So, for example, Linnaeus, who we know as incredibly influential in the history of the science of taxonomy, but also had this whole project where he was going to slowly acclimatise things like bananas to the Swedish climate by growing them slowly in more northerly gardens, various crops. So he was going to kind of push the boundary back of the temperate world, and so it's a rather sort of idealistic.
And there were acclimatisation societies, weren't they, which were dedicated to taking species around the world.
Yeah, which I didn't know about this one, which is in your book, I think, about birds in America.
Well, there's a guy in America who decided he wanted to introduce to America all the bird species that were in Shakespeare's plays. And he got quite a long way.
Is it 100?
No, there's only about. It's quite lucky, really, that Shakespeare was such a hopeless ornithologist.
You're probably right. But he had a good go. You know?
Well, yeah, and there's this wonderful fact about the fact that, you know, there's I think this word starling is mentioned once in Shakespeare, and as a result, 100 starlings were brought, imported into.
Central Park in New York,
released in Central Park, and now
I don't know how many billions, but
they're the biggest.
They're the most
numerous
profligate bird in North America. Yeah.
As a result of somebody's little fantasy about Shakespeare.
Thank you, Will. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that the idea of plants and animals being invasive. It seems to me that it comes about at the end of the 19th century. There's a moment where here we become insecure about our hold on the world. And so, for example, like in the 1880s, you get people, for the first time, they are worrying about apple imports. And people start to make a record. People start to get anxious and join apple societies and make records of all the local breeds of apple, or start hunting, understanding that wildflowers could become extinct. It's almost like there's a sort of that moment at which Victorian confidence goes. You know, around it's before the Boer War, but you know, at that point where men are being conscripted for the Boer War and then being turned away because they haven't actually grown tall enough to be in the army and carry the weapons they need to carry. At the same time, there's that anxiety about the sort of British body in that sense. There's also the kind of the body of British native flora and fauna. We suddenly go, oh, hang on a minute. It's under threat. And it's only at that point you suddenly get people talking about invasive species. And yet, one of the reasons there are invasive species, I don't know where the figure came from, it may be from you, that so many invasive species escaped from botanic gardens. Lantana, which is like in State of the World's Plants, this is the Kew report that came out about a month ago, Lantana, a really, 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 really serious threat. escaped from in Australia, escaped from the Botanic Garden in Melbourne, I
I
think.
think it was Melbourne. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that all seems such a sort of interesting shift. So now we're worried about invasives. You know, newspaper stories about spiders, your spiders, but also like Facebook. I've noticed lots of people fretting at the moment about, well, it is quite often spiders.
People have strong feelings about spiders.
Talking on the internet this autumn about false widows, having little kind of fretty moments about that. About the idea of an invasive spider, and when it bites you, it'll swell up, and then other people go, no, it won't.
It's amazing there are any Australians still alive, really, isn't it? Given how
They've got all
dangerous
the
spiders
nasty
are.
People are actually getting into arguments about whether or whether or not it will become an infected pussy mess.
But this, I mean, it feels like a kind of global thing. I mean, not something which, you know, as a result of the British Empire peaking and
There is a higher frequency of
It appears to be more
Yeah.
from the global angst.
Yeah,
Statistically across the world, though, there is a higher frequency of non-native species that have been introduced to former countries within, particularly the British Empire, and to some extent other Western European powers.
No, that's right. But I was thinking in terms of the
that's
angst,
really
where the
interesting
angst
figure.
came from, and whether that was whether we started the angst as well as the invasion.
I mean, I like this phrase you used, green xenophobia.
Yeah.
Because I think it does seem to be a kind of xenophobia, the kind of language that's being
So
used
could
around.
I ask
Sure.
Emma a question, whether was that at the same time that there were changes in people's attitudes to other peoples from other locations? Did those go in parallel, or were they completely different things?
That's a really interesting question that I probably have to think about for longer than.
Yeah.
No, but.
I don't.
Yeah.
Today, I don't see a particular correlation. I don't see that people who are racist are more likely to hate invasive species or vice versa. But I see very much the same.
We could get some stats on that.
We
couldn't
could.
we?
I don't. But I kind of see them as quite similar syndromes of thinking.
Well, they certainly
Yeah,
have very
well,
similar
as you
language.
said, conservative.
Yes,
You
yeah.
know, you can. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is similar language.
But there's no shame in hating invasive species, it seems. I mean, when I tweeted
Oh,
about
no,
this,
it's,
my colleague was
amongst
like,
them.
oh, fix it. Look, what, I hope you're going to find a fix for them. And
Amongst
this
some
about us.
groups of people, it is a source of pride.
Yeah.
Your hatred for them. It is an assertion of how British you think the British animals and plants should be. Almost, you know, it's a
Well, bizarrely,
slightly
the National
unnerving
Front
thing.
Had a line on it, had an ecological front somewhere which was based around this. I mean, that's a bit bizarre, but they did it. They adopted the language because it was just too convenient not to. I think so. They have an ecological policy as a result.
Ah.
Well,
I wouldn't want to
You've got
take
lots
that
of-
too
you've got
far,
a
but
few
it's
hands
curious.
up.
Okay, let's take some questions then. Two at the back, maybe we'll take the two at the same time. And
Just a quick one. It's interesting that you're talking about the invasive species in the British context, and if they are or they're not British, but our nation's invented by us anyway, so why does it matter if they were from here or not, if they're British or not? That's just a bit,
yeah, it's mad.
yeah.
And particularly if we add climate change, everything's moving its distribution anyway. So the idea of native distribution under those circumstances is, if it made any sense 100 years ago, it certainly doesn't any longer.
If I want to annoy environmental groups, I will point out that many of them are still virulently against alien species. They regard them as probably, after humans, the number one threat to ecology, to ecosystems around the planet. But they will, at the same time, talk about the need for migration corridors for species so that they can keep up with climate change. And I'm not sure whether you can really sort of ride both those horses at the same time. If you're going to have migration corridors so that species can move, then I think you have to recognise that species are going to move.
Just to sort of answer your question, though, about although national boundaries are clearly arbitrary, the reason that arguably it's useful to have, like, for example, a national checklist is just because you cannot know what has gone if you don't know what was there to start with. I know that sounds sort of like I'm stating the obvious, but that's why you need to know. You just you literally can't sort of do the work unless you know what was there to start with.
And it's also political realism. We live in countries, and if you're going to do anything with nature, that's what we've got.
But it does get a bit difficult when you start bringing in the European Union. I mean, I hate to sort of sound a bit like a Brexiteer, but the European Union has now written a list of species that are regarded as invasive and dangerous for the whole of Europe, so that you have species which are absolutely no problem at all in Britain, but can be a bit invasive in the waterways of Spain, are now sort of verboten across the whole of Europe because they're a problem in one particular country, which I think is an example of somewhat perverse sort of political outcome.
It went both ways.
Well, that is true. I think why that happens. It has to be said that horticulture is one of the biggest problems in terms of invasive species.
Yeah, that's right.
In terms of even in terms of things like the ash borer beetle, which you think, ash trees. How is that affected by horticulture? But actually, horticulturalists transport large numbers of fully grown trees across Europe every year, and so even tree problems are created by gardeners.
Sorry, thank you. I was just going to say, firstly off, this is a very interesting conversation. It's not really a perspective I've heard discussed in many other forums, so thank you for that. I think my question was, so if we're not, I feel like maybe the conversation is going away from possibly, well, I'd like to ask, can the conversation be redirected from, say, biodiversity for the sake of biodiversity, and to possibly something like resilience of these habitats as a whole, because species don't exist in isolation from one another. They interact with one another in a very dynamic and ever-changing way, and also thinking about the resilience of those habitats in what could be quite a short period of time, both geographically and ecologically, in terms of the effects of climate change. So will, as possibly some people imagine, invasive species, this maybe will's a strong word, but would it affect do you think it will affect the resilience of habitats over the short term in terms of climate change, trying to remove ourselves from all the other impacts that humans have? Or do you think it can actually benefit the resilience of those habitats and the roles they play in interacting with each other? So, for example, riparian habitats and silt washing into marine habitats and all those sort of things. Sorry, I know that's a very broad question, but thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to go at that? That's a tough one.
Well, so first of all, just a sort of word of language about sort of what you mean by habitats, and I'll sort of answer it rhetorically, that the problem with the definition of a habitat is essentially it's an assemblage of species that are in a particular place at a particular time of a particular abundance. And we know from the history of life on Earth over the last million years, really, and that when the environment changes, for example, in past changes of the climate, when we've gone into ice ages and then back into temporary warm periods, back into cold periods, that the sets of species that exist in any location change. But they don't all move together. They move at different rates and often in different directions. So the exact sets of species we have in our habitats now are essentially an assemblage of those species that have arrived and established at this particular time. And as the environment changes in the future, then somewhat different sets of species and different relative abundances are going to exist instead. And that changeover indeed can help maintain resilience. So if, for example, an area has got a forest and it starts to get drier, if species of tree that can cope with drier conditions move in, then that forest might in some senses be more resilient in the future. Now, as the climate changes, the home advantage, if you like, of the species that were present in a place will start to go away, and the so-called non-native species, including invasive species, will increasingly be on an equal footing. We have to realise that in the present day, so we've already heard Fred referring to the problem that conservationists think that species need to keep up with climate change. And this is quite interesting because in the context of climate change, there is no doubt whatsoever that certainly for plants and probably for most groups of animals as well, humans are now the main dispersal agent. We move more things, more, at least over long distances, than kind of any other mechanism. So some people are seeing that as the problem, and as Fred said, you could turn it on its head and see that is the solution. So if new things come in, you've still got some ecosystem, still, let's say you've got a forest growing, but it's now, so in the foothills of the Alps, there's a extraordinarily interesting forest where deciduous forest is turning into broad-leaved evergreens, but most of those species can come from Asia or North America or somewhere else in the world, because there aren't very many species of broad-leaved evergreen that are native to Europe. They mostly died out in the ice ages. And so whether you should think that this is now a forest, and it's a vigorous forest, but it's a very different composition. And it is really how we as humans decide we're going to respond to this as to whether we now think, okay, it's now more resilient because we've got these non-native species in the system, or it's somehow it's moved away from how we think it should be.
It would be really, really useful if we could measure resilience, but I don't think anybody knows how to measure resilience, really, do they? You watch a system until it crashes, and then you say, that wasn't very resilient, was it? And while it doesn't crash, you think it's resilient. So I think that's a really difficult concept. That's why I was trying to avoid answering the question, really. I don't think we can measure it. And, we can have sort of theoretical ideas about how it works, and that's, one view of as we're kind of saying it, of ecology is that assemblage of species as a sort of pristine or co-evolved set of species must be the most resilient. But some people will say that actually that's a sign of vulnerability, and what you need is sort of the seed of other species coming in to give it more resilient. I don't, it's a continuing argument.
Thanks. I can see lots of hands, but I do want to try and bring this back to a philosophical question for a moment before I go back to the audience. I mean, all of you are presupposing that it is our role to intervene in some way, that because we are already intervening in everything we do, unconsciously, in the environment, it's also our role to consciously make decisions which will alter the paths of the natural world around us, things that are happening around us. What kind of role of the human does this presuppose? Are we here to manage the world around us?
Well, except that there are so many really lovely examples of us intervening in cases about invasive species and then it not really going very well. It is quite interesting.
So we think we're managing things, and then nature always.
Well, not always. Okay, so one positive thing that people are doing in this country. The woodland, various organisations entrusted with looking after trees have instructed and trained a load of sort of citizen scientists to look at trees in parks or open landscape that they're assigned, and they need to go and look at those trees a certain amount of times a year and check them for invasive pests or signs of illness. So that's one way that people are involved, and then the argument is, immediately act to remove those trees. Then you have other people saying, like, so for example with ash trees, then you have other people going, well, 10% of ash trees, it's something like that, are going to be immune to ash dieback anyway. We should just leave it to to kind
Let
of
it
work
roll.
let it roll, exactly. Because whatever we do, it's like King Canute. It's standing on the beach and going, don't come in, see.
But the way we look at rewilding is quite interesting, because it seems to me that there are sort of two approaches to rewilding. Some people think rewilding is putting back old wild landscapes. So, 500 years ago, or whenever we think was the sort of baseline that we want to look at, there were those species. So we're going to reintroduce those and put them back in and try and sort of reassemble an old ecosystem as it once was, presumably thinking that then it will all work fine. But then there's another view which basically says, no, we shouldn't be in that kind of management game at all. We should just stand back and see what shows up, see what does well, what does badly, and not take a view about what should be there, but just let it be wild and see what happens. And there's a huge amount of debate about rewilding now, and lots of people want to do rewilding, especially all over Europe and elsewhere. But there do seem to be these two approaches, and they're not really reconciled at the minute.
And I mean, in what I do, what happens is I see the animal studies people kind of banging heads with the environmentalists, because the animal studies people say, no, it's not okay to go and exterminate all of those rats or mink or crayfish or whatever.
So for me, there's two me's. There's still the odd neuron that fires in my head, which is this little child who loves nature and wants to do everything for it. But professional me as an ecologist and as an evolutionary biologist, nature doesn't care. Nature just happens. Life on Earth goes on, and we're going to perturb it, and some things are going to come through this. And so this is all about us and our attitudes to nature. The processes of the birth and death of individuals of each population, of each species goes on. The genetics of change go on. And unless we were to do something very odd, like release a form of artificial life that can consume all types of current living cell, for example, which is not completely impossible, but it's very difficult to imagine anything that is really going to exterminate life on Earth until our lovely planet burns up in the death throes of the sun. And so from that perspective, what we're talking about really is how we would like the world to be, because evolution, life, it has no ultimate purpose. We're just a funny accident, weird accident that happened along the way, and we're dealing with it.
It's not nature that's fragile, I'm sure it's us.
And yet, I suppose the important thing about our the neuron that's firing, the single neuron, or however many, the few.
I've got several.
No. I mean, sentimentally, the thing that's really interesting is that when you want to get people involved, you want to get people committed, it's those, especially childhood memories of nature. It's so experiential stuff that motivate people the most. People can't really get that fired up.
And I think what I'm trying to do is, to some extent, point out where there are apparently contradictions between what people would like to do and what the actual consequences are of what they're doing, and where people are doing certain things because they think it's the right thing, but there might actually be more effective or efficient way of responding that actually would suit what their inner desires just as well or even better.
You've been very patient with your questions. Thank you. I think you two have had your hands up for a very long time. Yep, one after the other.
Hi. We've talked a lot about how invasive species and overall there's been kind of like a net gain in terms of species number and diversity. But what about and kind of how that almost means the reaction to invasive species is too much. But what about the impact that they have on kind of ecosystems as a whole? And if you have, because I'm thinking specifically of rivers and riparian habitats, if you have a dominance of a species like Himalayan Balsam, in turn you'll obviously get a loss generally of other species along the bank, and how that then would have impacts on pollinators, birds, bats, and kind of how that, what's your view on that in terms of, isn't that therefore an issue even if there hasn't been a net loss of species in general?
We take the question next to you as well.
So I guess my question is, what do you think is the responsibility of scientists in the case of invasive or non-native species when it comes to the cultural significance of species, especially in cases where something is introduced like through a process of colonization or something like that, where like I also don't know if there are historic cases where like species have gone extinct that were used by like indigenous peoples, and that extinction was caused by the introduction of non-native species. And I know that that's kind of like not necessarily just like a question of ecology, but also like science and society interacting. So just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
I mean, on Himalayan balsam and that whole area, I mean, there's always going to be winners and losers. As we said, I think extinctions are pretty rare, but I mean, locally populations of particular species may decline and some may revive. Himalayan balsam can give cover for various species along riverbanks, so it's...
Beekeepers love it.
Yeah, and as you say, beekeepers certainly love Himalayan balsam. So, I mean, there are winners and losers, and it's not only... I mean, quite a lot of species show invasive tendencies, if you like, a tendency to take over in particular environments, often disturbed environments which humans have messed up one way or another. But I mean, native ones like brambles and nettles, perhaps particularly, if they were foreign, we'd be complaining about those a great deal. But we tend not to talk so much about them because they're regarded as native. So again, it has to do, I think, with our perceptions quite a lot. But yeah, if you have a new species that comes into an area, there's going to be change. And I suppose the bottom line here is if you think change is bad of itself, then you're not going to like invasive species because they tend to stir up change. But if you think change is a sign of, sort of nature going into overdrive or evolving and adapting, and nettles do very well in a nitrogen-rich environment. If you don't like nettles, get rid of the nitrogen-rich environment rather than trying to chop down nettles. I mean, there are different approaches that one can take to things that we might not like. But, broadly, I think kind of change is good.
I think also, just to clarify, I don't know about Himalayan balsam, but I know that there are many case studies where people have returned to look at places where an invasive species did seem to be establishing itself in an environment, and that then once the situation has slightly more stabilised, especially where something is colonised in a disturbed environment. And you might argue that our rivers in the UK have been a disturbed environment, many of them, in the last 40 years. That when people have returned to look again, they find that the invasive has dropped in numbers. It's not always a straight story of blah 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 all the way up the graph. It can be a story of up and then down.
I think that's the norm, actually. I mean, some species get a head start for whatever local reason, and they go on a boom, but then
their pests and diseases effectively catch up with them.
Or something decides that, I could eat this new species that's come in, and you're certainly changing the ecosystem, but you very often see boom followed by bust.
So, if I could carry on the balsam story, but bring in the other question, because I think balsam's a very interesting one, because although it's common along riversides, it's often growing in places where the main nutrient-rich environments where often it would otherwise be nettles and brambles and things. And so I think it's quite interesting for a number of reasons. So just imagine that Himalayan balsam, this is for anyone who doesn't know what Himalayan balsam is, it's this pink-flowered thing that you see particularly along stream banks and damp places, and it's got those seed pods that pop when they're ripe, and they go like that, and it's great if when they're nearly ripe, get an unsuspecting friend to say, just pick that, and they go like this, and it's really great. But just imagine that we thought they were native. So this was a species that arrived in the Himalayas, from the Himalayas, and many of the plants that got to northwestern Europe at the beginning of the current warm period of climate managed to make it across the European plain, arrived in northwest Europe. And others didn't, and they became restricted to mountain ranges like the Pyrenees, the Alps, or for that matter, the Himalayas. So they didn't make it north, and they became restricted to mountain ranges. And some of those species, when we've moved them, like balsam, we've discovered they do very well. But if we thought they were native, they're these pink flowers. People clearly think they're very attractive. They grew them as garden plants. And I find it terribly interesting that it is, I think, I've never actually done it statistically, but I'm just sitting there as an armchair television watcher. But when there are historical dramas on, I do think that Himalayan balsam is the single commonest plant that is put in the foreground by filmmakers when you've got some country, you're making some, Downton or something in the background, and you've got this pretty pink flower in the front. Now, so that is sort of a cultural value that it's already obtaining, and so this is where the other question come in. I think that we often don't think of the cultural benefits we could obtain from these non-native species, rather than all. So there are some plants that are being harvested in new parts of the world. So in the case of balsam, it's used for nectar and pollen and beekeepers love it because it's a time of year when it's one of those abundant and it's got lots and lots of nectar. And so perhaps rather than, it is inevitable, it's here now, and however much you cut it down, it's a pretty pointless exercise. It's not going to work. So we might as well make use of it instead.
But if it were declining, you think we'd be complaining and saying it was a threatened species, and how can we save it?
If it had been here for long enough.
We've got 5 minutes, and I want to fit in a couple more questions. So,
thank you for your answers and your very entertaining talks. I have actually got 2 questions.
No, just one, please.
Okay, fine. I mean, I'm drawing from Lukács actually with the concept of nature because, if we are talking about nature, I would put it in parentheses because not parentheses, sorry, but basically Lukács, he's kind of theorizing that what we think is nature is kind of derived from second nature, which is a social construct. So as ecologists or scientists, where do you put human in this equation?
As part of nature. We evolve from nature. We are altering the rest of nature. We are still part of nature, in my opinion. But most ecologists and most environmentalists treat nature as though it is something completely other than us.
Exactly. So in this world situation where the land, there's a lot of urbanization going on. And when you talk about ecology, are you including these urban areas into, so you, as academics and scientists, I would like to ask, how do you position yourself in the dialogue between what you study and social spaces in the terms of cohabiting in city areas? Yeah.
I think urban ecosystems are there's probably more evolution going on in urban ecosystems than anywhere else, and yet they're probably the least researched kinds of ecosystems. So I think there's a new sort of discipline getting going on looking at urban ecosystems, which I'm sure is going to come up with some really fascinating stuff in the next few years.
Yep.
Thank you. It was mentioned quite a bit earlier that if an invasive species is prosperous, then it's dynamic and it has the potential to be used to revive ecosystems. I just wanted to quickly ask, what does revive constitute? How would you practically go about it? And is it really sort of that simple?
Thank you. Sorry, Fred, can we just take this one last question and then you can respond to them together?
Yeah, I'm wondering, how do you think this debate changes with genetic engineering and possibly CRISPR and gene drives in the future?
Thank you. So, question about reviving ecosystems and one about genetic engineering, and you have 2 minutes for all of it.
Let me just do reviving ecosystems very quick. I mean, nature will get on with it. I mean, there's quite a famous example of the Puerto Rico where people destroyed all the forests and went farming, and then they've messed up the land so much that they've given up on the farming and they've gone to work in factories in the capital. Nature could recover. Nature could move back into those fields. It turned out that the native species, the native Caribbean species, weren't up to it. I mean, the farmers had messed up the land so much they couldn't get back. The species that have invaded and are, if you like, rewilding those former fields are actually things like the African tulip, which Europeans brought in as ornamental plants for their gardens. And they've sort of leapt over the garden fence and are now reviving the ecosystem, putting it back together, improving the soils and so on, so that finally the native species can get a toehold. So, I mean, nature will kind of tend to do it on its own, I think.
Emma, any thoughts?
I don't know. You just made me think. I think when I was thinking about this talk, I thought quite a lot. I don't know. Have you read the Red and Green Mars, Kim Stanley Robinson? I don't know if anybody knows the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. He's a science fiction writer, but in that book they colonise Mars, and they genetically modify sort of bacteria in order to terraform. That is, to make Mars in the image of Earth. It seems to me that there's so much drama that arises when you start talking about modifying nature. And in that book it becomes a political issue. It's really interesting. Sorry, that made me think of that.
So alien species on Mars.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because they start sort of like having fights about whether Mars should be left in its pristine state or.
So
You've got 30 seconds.
I would answer the last couple of questions and quite a lot of the other questions with one word: Anthropocene.
Yeah.
We've got our finger on the thermometer of the Earth. We've got our finger on all of the habitats on the Earth, the distributions of species, and including modifying and generating new organisms that might live alongside. And so, whether we want it or not, we are effectively the keystone species of our planet right now, and we need to use our judgment quite carefully.
Terrifying. So we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming. Join me in thanking our speakers.